Hello everyone, welcome to the E3 Student Conference. Today our guest speaker is Dr. Brent Bennett. The topic of the day is energy storage for electric grid, a challenge of technology and scale. Dr. Brent Bennett is the policy director for Light Powered, an initiative of Texas Public Policy Foundation to raise America's energy IQ. As a part of Light Powered team, Dr. Bennett regularly speaks with policymakers, energy experts, and industry associations across the country. He is responsible for research, fact-checking, and spearheading many of the team's policy and regulatory initiatives. He has written extensively about energy technologies, energy and utility regulation, and how America has improved its environment while growing its energy use. Dr. Bennett has Master of Science and PhD in Materials Science and Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of Tulsa. His graduate research focused on advanced chemistries for utility-scale energy storage systems. Prior to joining the foundation, Dr. Bennett worked for startup companies selling carbon nanotubes to battery manufacturers, and he continues to provide technology consulting to energy storage companies. So, Dr. Bennett, we are glad to be here today.
Thank you for having me, Rahima and Dr. Suleiman. I'm honored to get to speak to students. It's not often that usually I'm speaking to policymakers and industry groups, things like that. So people like that. So it's always great when I get a chance to speak with the student conference and an environment like this. So I really appreciate the invitation. The reason that I titled my talk as such, the challenge of technology and scale, is because a lot of times when we talk about energy storage and we hear about, for example, the Earthshot programs that the Department of Energy is promoting right now, energy storage being one of those, we frame it in terms a lot in terms of the moon, the program to send astronauts to the moon in the 60s, right? And we think about it as a technology problem. But it's not just a technology problem, it's also a problem of scale. And so that's kind of what I want to highlight in this talk today. It's not just about sending 3 astronauts to the moon, it's about sending the entire country to the moon, right? As one of my friends likes to put it. So it's not just that you need the technology to get you there, but you also need the scale. So what I'll kind of do throughout this talk is kind of set up the problem, the need for energy storage on the electric grid, and what the application space is. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the things that we're doing in that space to improve the technology to get it up to scale that's needed. But also kind of leave a little bit of, I like to leave a little bit of the end the part at the end open-ended to, for y'all to ask questions about, specific ideas or technologies that you've heard of or that are on your mind. I don't tend to do too much of a massive survey of the entire energy storage space and all the companies that are involved. It's pretty vast. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of that at the end, but really save that for some of the questions if you want. So let's dive in it real quick. Just a little bit about myself, especially when I'm talking to students. I always kind of want to give a couple minutes about kind of how I got to where I am. So as this little meme says right here, I'm a battery engineer who can never keep my batteries charged. I'm always the absent-minded professor who forgets to plug his phone in. So I have, and I always say that if I can ever find an opportunity to go work on wireless charging, then that's something that I would definitely get involved in. It's a huge problem for me. But I grew up in Midland, Texas, in the oil and gas business. I know many people here are in petroleum engineering or related programs. So that was my background is in the oil and gas business. But back in the 20 years ago, we thought that the domestic oil and gas business was on the decline. Peak oil was the talk of the industry, and I didn't think there was much of a future in the business. This is, of course, before the shale revolution of the mid 2000s and early part of the last decade. So I decided to go study physics, really enjoyed science. And in the process of getting my degree in college about 15 years ago, I was really noticing the the growing need for energy storage if we were going to use large amounts of wind and solar on the electric grid. And so I don't want to say that I was too prescient, but I was prescient enough to go and pursue that as my graduate research. my PhD at University of Texas, where they have a lot of great battery research going on, and I was fortunate to be a part of that. After getting out of school, I wound up with a startup as a materials supplier to battery companies. When that venture didn't work out for me, I was trying to stay in Austin and stay here in Texas with my wife and my family here. I ended up going into energy policy. So I think the two lessons from that are, first of all, to use your time in school and especially your internships to figure out not just what you like to study, but what you like to do every day, day in and day out. What I found for me is that that's energy. I love to study energy. And as much as politics is a bit of a drag and policy space that I operate in, the fact that I get to get up every day and study energy and communicate about energy really keeps me going. That's what makes this job great. So really figure out that thing that really drives you, and then be flexible. Be flexible about how you approach those things that you really enjoy, and finding ways to incorporate that into your work, or to take a job that allows you to do that every day. So with that, we'll get to the topic at hand. So when we talk about electricity, we usually talk about generating electricity, right? And so one popular topic of conversation these days is the falling cost to generate electricity from wind and solar, right? And you see these reports from Lazard and other companies every year that talk about how now the cost to generate electricity from wind and solar is actually lower than the cost to generate it from other sources like coal and natural gas, right? So that's kind of what you see in this plot here. The unsubsidized cost is pretty comparable when you add the federal subsidies in. The cost to generate from wind and solar is actually lower than that of conventional sources, which is why you're seeing nowadays almost all the new builds across the electric grid in the United States are wind and solar, particularly here in Texas. We've had a net loss of gas and coal generation over the last decade, and all our demand growth is being met through wind and solar generation. So that's kind of what you're seeing going on right now. The problem is that the cost to generate electricity is not the whole picture. You also have to transport it and you have to store it, right? And so when we talk about using wind and solar on the margins, and we're just generating it and using it as is, then that's okay. But when you start to require a large chunk of it to power a large chunk of your grid, then you start to think about those transportation and storage costs in a big way. And in Texas, we're now at about 30% wind and solar generation for our grid. And that's becoming a really big question now is, what is it going to take we've already spent a lot on transmission, which I can show you here. And just in the over the last decade, we saw almost doubling of the transmission costs per unit of energy produced in Texas, because we spent billions of dollars to build transmission lines out to West Texas to bring in that cheap wind and solar energy, right? So in a certain sense, the transmission build has offset some of the gains that we've made from having that lower cost energy, because it takes so much transmission to get it from there to where it's used, right? So that's a big problem. The other problem, and then what we'll discuss today, is storage, right? Fossil fuels are really cheap energy storage. That's why they've been so good at powering our electric grid. It's because we've taken all the energy from the sun over millions of years and baked it into these fuels that are now very dense, easy to transport, and easy to store, and very flexible too. So that's part of what the challenge that you have to meet with now wind and solar generation is. You can generate that electricity cheaply, but can you store it cheaply, right? Because that, we always talk about how wind and solar are intermittent, right? The wind doesn't always show, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine when and where you want it. But fossil fuels are they're discrete energy sources too, in the sense that you don't always have them where you need them, right? We're seeing that today. We're seeing a lot of supply bottlenecks that are leading to rising prices, particularly in Europe, right? It's the fact that the fossil fuels are cheap to transport and to store that makes them what we call reliable, right? And so that's really that's the big thing. If we can store wind and solar energy cheaply, then it could be a reliable energy source, which is not right now. Now, the problem is that, again, energy storage is not cheap. Storing electricity is not cheap, right? So what I have here is a kind of a cost comparison. The natural gas one there is out of date because natural gas prices have roughly doubled since I last made this graphic not too long ago. But even still, you see that the cost of storing energy in coal, natural gas versus a typical lithium-ion battery is there's about a 10x difference there. Now, the way you get to this is you say, and this is kind of a back of the envelope calculation, but the capital cost of that battery is actually about $600 million. And then, you divide it by 2,000 cycles, which is roughly a long lifetime for a battery, a grid storage battery, and you get to about 10x the cost of storing that same amount of energy on a per cycle basis compared to coal and natural gas, right? So this is, again, looking at kind of getting closer to what it takes to actually replace a power plant, not just to store a little bit of energy on the margins, but actually what you need for an entire power plant, right? So when you hear a lot of times that, and you'll hear me say this later, that we're, about 10 times the lithium-ion batteries as they stand now at the current capital cost, about 10 times what they need to be to start replacing power plants. That's really what we're talking about, right? This is kind of a back of the envelope way to get to that number. Of course, there's a lot of other people who've done much more sophisticated models to kind of arrive at the same conclusion, but I'm just trying to lay out to you again how much we have to do to get to that point, right? Now, there are a lot of problems in the interim that we can solve with batteries, and I'll use Texas as an example here, because again, we're getting close to about 30% wind and solar generation, and we're running up against kind of our limit as far as what we can do without more energy storage. We can add a little more solar, I think, without energy storage, but we're going to need to either start subsidizing backup generation or putting in more energy storage. And that's something the Public Utility Commission, in the wake of what happened in February and the outages then, is considering heavily right now. And so this is an example of what happened in 2019, the summer of 2019. This February is not the first time that we've had problems or warning signs with our grid. We've been pretty tight for the last several years in the summer. And it was only because of COVID reducing demand that we were able to kind of get out of it last summer. And then this past summer, we just had really good weather. It was mild in Texas. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing that basically in August of 2019, we had our highest demand hour during this week was actually, and this is still our record demand, of all-time record demand in Texas, is 74.5 gigawatts. That day had a lot more wind generation, so our demand on our gas, coal, and nuclear fleet, which is in red there, was actually lower than it was on subsequent days when we had a little bit lower demand, but we also had a lot less wind. Right, so it's actually the not just the demand now, but actually the amount of wind generation that drives how much we need our coal and gas and nuclear generation in Texas. Right, that net demand is being driven not just by total demand, but also by the output of wind and solar. Right, and so this is a problem that you can solve with batteries, which is at their current scale, where we're getting to, which is the storing a little bit of energy on the margins for a couple of hours, right? So in the summertime, typically you're seeing these levels of demand during the late afternoon hours for about 4 or 5 hours. And then once the sun goes down, then demand starts to drop. The wind tends to pick up and we get out of the woods, so to speak. So if you're needing to store, especially with solar, you can store solar energy from earlier in the afternoon to later in the afternoon, and store a few % of the grid's output on the margins. You can really help with some of these kind of what we call intraday reliability concerns, right? And if you have a sudden drop off in wind or solar output, or a power plant goes off, line, and that energy storage can come online in a flash and help you keep your grid stable, right? So this is something that we're already close to being able to do, and that we're going to start to see happen more and more in Texas as we're starting to build out some more energy storage in Texas. Now, the winter storm in February that we had was a whole different scenario. And this is something that we're a long ways from fixing with energy storage. When you have a multi-day weather event, and even if we had all of the weather, all the plants, all the weather problems that occurred, the gas supply problems, all the things that the Public Utility Commission is working on fixing right now and trying to get power plants to upgrade, even if all that had been fixed, we would have still been, and also if the wind turbines had performed as expected, if we didn't have any wind turbines freezing, anything like that, we would have still been short of electricity for more than 24 hours during that storm. And at some points up to about 12-15% of our total 10 gigawatts of our total energy needs during that time. And so this is something that the amount of energy that you see represented, which is basically the gap here between this dotted line and then the shaded areas, right? That white space there is how short we were. That amount of energy storage represents currently about 160 gigawatt hours. We say gigawatt hours is our unit or megawatt hours on the electric grid. That's about how much current lithium-ion battery production in the entire world is right now. So the entire world production of lithium-ion batteries, you take 1 year of that, would cover roughly what that difference is right there. And that difference is only going to grow because right now we're relying entirely on wind and solar in Texas to meet our demand growth. Our installations of coal, gas, and nuclear are basically flat. Our demand is growing, and we're relying on wind and solar to meet that demand growth, right? So this is something, again, roughly 1,000 times difference in scale compared to, the intraday problems that you see here in the summertime, storing a little bit of energy for a few hours versus storing large chunks of the energy that the grid needs over the course of multiple days, right? So that's really the as we get into what we call deeper decarbonization and getting wind and solar beyond from where we are in Texas at 30% to beyond 50%. That's really where you start to run into these needs, these really big scale demands. And this is coming in Texas too. This is actually some work that I did a couple years ago, modeling what kind of just some hypothetical scenarios of what we would need to meet our demand in 2030 with different resource mixes. So in 2019, I took 2018 data and was forecasting forward to what we thought would be the scenario in 2030. Well, what we thought would happen in 2030 under current policies, we're actually going to reach that resource mix next year. Pretty much. We're not going to have quite that much gas capacity, but we're pretty much going to have that same amount of resource mix next year. And we're going to be at about 34% wind and solar output as a total of our grid. If we're going to get to and pretty soon, if we continue, we could easily get to 50% by 2025 if we continue on the current growth rate. That is, if we are able to add enough energy storage capacity. You can see there's a big jump in energy storage capacity here between the second and third columns. And also, if we're able to maintain most of our current dispatchable fleet, right, our coal, gas, and nuclear fleet. In this scenario, I took coal and retired it prematurely. Probably what you would see is not that much gas, but more of a mix of gas and coal to meet that need for the firm 50% of our grid. So, but now if you go from there, you go to 80% and then 100%, you can see at 80%, we can still, if we are able to maintain a lot of our gas generation, we can keep the need for energy storage down. But as you go, and I think this is kind of an underestimate now in hindsight, But if you go to 80 and then to 100%, that need for battery capacity, for energy storage capacity, goes way up. And that number right there on the right basically represents about a day worth of energy storage for the entire state of Texas. And that's a pretty conservative estimate of what we would need to be 100% powered by wind and solar for Texas. And so that's a really, it's just an exponential increase as you go beyond 50%, your need for energy storage starts to increase exponentially. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those challenges later. But let's just think about, again, so seeing that kind of that scale problem there, how does this apply to kind of the rest of the US, right? So if you look at again, it's a 2020 production of lithium-ion batteries, which are most of what's being used for energy storage on the grid right now. That 200 gigawatt hours that we produced in 2020 is roughly equal to about 2 hours of US demand. And again, I said in Texas, it would take at least a minimum of 1 day worth of electricity storage to go 100% wind and solar, right? But in other parts of the US, especially in the north, that don't have as good of a resource mix of wind and solar, we have a really ideal mix in Texas. And we can go 50%. If you go see back here, we can pretty much use 50% wind and solar in terms of installed capacity, roughly equal amounts, and they balance each other really well, and we're able to meet most of our demand that way. In other parts of the U.S., you can't use solar as much because they're not as sunny as Texas, and so that's a really big problem. So you're more likely you're going to need somewhere between a day and a month of demand, probably close to a week of electricity storage to meet a lot of most of U.S. electricity demand with wind and solar. So this is a huge scale problem. You're talking about 1,000-fold increase compared to what we have now on the grid to where we need to be over the next 30 years or so if we're going to make this happen. So that's a really it's a huge challenge. We have technologies. I always say we have technologies that work, but we haven't come anywhere close to getting those technologies up to the scale that's required. And just to give you one example of kind of the demands that this would put on the global supply chain, just look at lithium, right? If we were to meet this demand if we were to meet it with lithium. Now I'll go later on, I'll talk about how we're looking at a lot of different technologies other than lithium for the grid. But for electric vehicles, you're pretty much going to be stuck with lithium because it's the lightest metal in the periodic table. And that power to weight ratio is so critical for electric cars. We're looking at sodium and some other ideas for your base metals for electric vehicle batteries, but more than likely we're going to end up with lithium because it's just that power to weight ratio is so key. And so if you were to take again that 2020 production of global production of lithium-ion batteries and apply that to the grid, to the U.S. grid for 23 years, next 23 years between now roughly and 2045, that'll give you about 1 day of electricity demand. You would need, in order to produce 20 million electric vehicles a year, which is about what our current vehicle production rate is in the U.S., you would actually need about 3 times that much to produce that many electric vehicles. And so you're basically looking at about a 10x increase in global battery production and a 4x increase in lithium production. Because again, not all lithium is used for batteries, it's used for a lot of other things. So just you would need to increase it by that much just to meet US demand for electric vehicles and for the grid. So this is a huge supply chain problem when you think about how much the US is just a small portion of the world's population, and how much China, India, and some of the larger countries are going to use if they're going to go with electric vehicles and if they're going to need energy storage. Because China is facing a lot of problems too with reliability because they have a lot of installed wind and solar, and they're facing some similar problems with reliability that we are in Texas. And they're going to be using a lot of energy storage as well. And they're the ones that are building the most of it right now. So again, this is going to be a real massive supply chain issue just to even get part of the way there, much less to get all the way there. And there's also the problem of time, right? How long it takes to bring technologies to market. There's a lot of great ideas that exist in the lab, but to get them to market and to get them up to commercial scale and viability is also a really big challenge. Of course, I've been very much aware of that in some of my past experience, and it continues to be the biggest challenge. Is that battery technology is fundamentally different from semiconductors. I hate these comparisons to how to trying to compare batteries to other forms of high tech, because batteries and semiconductors are fundamentally different physics. And batteries improve, the rate of energy density improves by roughly 5% a year, not the 50% a year that our computing power improves, right? And that's been pretty true for the last roughly 40 to 50 years, ever since we really started to see batteries become, well, maybe the last 30 to 40 years since we saw batteries being used in consumer applications, right? Like the first cell phones, for example. We've seen roughly 5% per year increases in energy density, right? Not 50%. And we're not going to see 50%. It's just a function of physics. We got a lot of smart people out there working on these problems, and we're continuing to make improvements, but it's a slow process. Typically, as we saw from the original lithium-ion battery, which was invented in roughly 1980, to the time to market was about 12 years, and Sony commercialized the first product in 1991. And you saw another 10 more years to dominate the market, for lithium-ion to dominate the market. That's roughly still true today. We're seeing the second generation of lithium-ion batteries, which were invented in the lab about 15 years ago. There's a great book called Powerhouse, if you want to read it, about the Argonne National Labs and how some of these chemistries were invented for the current generation of lithium-ion batteries that are starting to enter the market now. So that happened about 15 years ago. You're seeing now those are entering the market, and those are going to start to dominate over the next several years. And the Tesla Model 3, a lot of the other newer electric cars that are coming out are starting to use some of these Gen 2 lithium-ion battery technologies. So that's starting to happen. So that's starting to happen now. What we're seeing in the lab now and starting to approach commercial products probably over the next 3 to 4 years are lithium metal anodes, and what we call solid state batteries, lithium-ion batteries. And those provide a big jump in energy density. Again, that 5x jump is not going to happen like that. It's a gradual evolution of the technology, but eventually we'll get to where those batteries have a lot more energy density than today's lithium-ion batteries. And we'll start to probably see commercial products again by 2025. And between 2030 and 2035, we'll start to see those gradually come to dominate the marketplace. And then we'll have, hopefully a gradual evolution towards the lithium air battery, which is kind of what we call the dream battery, because it uses lithium and oxygen. It doesn't get much lighter than that. And there's also some ideas for using pure metal cathodes with light metals. Some folks at the University of Texas are working on that. It's really interesting stuff. But those ideas are kind of in the lab right now, but we really haven't seen a real product come out, a real workable product come out of the labs yet, but we're working on it. And so maybe in 20 years, you might, given the usual timeline, you might see those come to dominate the market. And then we've kind of reached the end, at least in terms of what we can get using current knowledge of physics and chemistry. We kind of reached the end of the energy storage line, right? And so I think that's where we're going for electric vehicles. For grid storage, lithium is definitely going to play a role, but at least with grid storage, you aren't so confined by power to weight ratio. It's more about cost, right? And certainly greater energy density reduces the cost, but it's not everything. And so we not only have other options for lithium for grid storage, but we need them, right? Because we need to have diverse supply chains, and we need to be able to scale up numerous technologies at the same time to meet different application spaces, and also just to have the diversity of storage for the grid, depending on the right, where you are geographically, what resources you have access to, and so on. It will really help us if we can use things other than lithium. So So what are some of the things that we're working that is being looked at to replace that cheap fossil energy storage, right? Again, you gotta think about how that the graphic I showed a little while ago, how we're right now our storage costs are 10x of what they need to be to really start to replace power plants, right? So you have a lot of options in the mechanical and thermal space. Really interesting. I'm an electrochemist, so I'm not as familiar with these. These are more mechanical systems. But you have, of course, the current dominant technology in the market is pumped hydro, pumping water up and down a hill. That's still the vast majority of energy storage on the grid worldwide is from pumped hydro. There's a lot of it in Norway. That's how a lot of how Germany and the UK are able to get such high renewable penetrations, up to 50% of their electricity coming from wind and solar. It's because they can rely on Norway and the hydro in Norway and Sweden to basically store a lot of that energy. Now they also still use a lot of biomass there as well, which we don't have in Texas or in the U.S. largely. So again, that mechanical storage from pumping water down a hill is a big thing. Thermal storage is really interesting. Something also can be used a lot in buildings. We're starting to see more of that, especially in grocery stores. They're starting to look into that a lot, using their thermal systems for cooling all their refrigerators. It's also means of energy storage. So that's something that is being looked at both on the small scale and on the big scale. You're also seeing companies like Energy Vault, I believe out of Switzerland, that have a system of stacking concrete blocks. So it's basically another form of gravity energy storage. And you also have compressed air and some other things. So there's a lot of different options in that space. Maybe we'll see some innovation to bring the cost down. The problem is that all those systems are very low density and difficult to deploy. Right, compressed air, pumped hydro require a certain geography to work. Other systems like the gravity storage are very low energy density, so they take a lot of space, and they're difficult to build. So there's kind of another realm, which is the third thing down here, is high energy density batteries, right, which is lithium-ion batteries primarily. And in the grid storage space, you're also seeing a lot of people looking at sodium and other heavier metals because, again, power rate ratio is not as important. It's more about cost. The big problem with those is there's safety concerns. Of course, you're storing a lot of energy in a small space. Chemically, we've seen a lot of problems with fires and lithium-ion batteries on the grid. Some of those, I think, problems will be solved over time. But you also just have the problem of first of all, the more expensive materials and manufacturing process to make high energy density batteries, and also the fact that it's more difficult to scale those batteries for long duration storage. It's just not as straightforward to stack a lot of lithium-ion batteries together to create a longer duration storage system. It's more expensive to do that. It's better to start with a chemistry or a battery technology that's more suited for long duration storage. It's purpose built for that. The lithium-ion batteries were built for your cell phone, right? Which is not long duration energy storage at all. And we need energy storage for multiple days if we're going to really start to get serious about energy storage on the grid. So the in-between road, which is the road that I followed when I was in graduate school, was looking at kind of low energy density batteries, primarily what we call flow batteries, which is depicted in that diagram down there in the bottom right. Basically where you have ions dissolved in solution and you pump those charged ions through a cell, kind of like a fuel cell. You pump them through the cell to charge and discharge. The advantage of those systems is that you can use cheaper materials, and you also have scalability. If you need more duration, you just make bigger tanks. And so there's an advantage to that. The problem is that with flow batteries and a lot of these other systems, there's a lot of similar systems. There's often mechanical parts if you're pumping fluid through the system or other kind of materials. There's a lot of extra costs other than just the materials cost. Again, you have system level costs that go into this. So it's a big challenge to try and bring some of those down and to get systems that can actually be competitive at a very low cost. So I've also thought about some other ideas, and one of those is, well, what about potatoes? right? They're cheap. They're 100% renewable. No, actually, potatoes. I'm just kidding. Actually, potatoes are used as when you make a potato battery. What you're doing is the copper and the galvanized nails are stuck in the potato, and those provide the energy output of the battery. You're not actually storing energy; it's a chemical reaction. The potatoes are just providing the electrolyte, right? But you know, it's. I bring this up because unfortunately, a lot of people are, especially investors and policymakers, are kind of their lack of knowledge in this area and of the challenges of energy storage at scale make them fall prey to a lot of silly ideas and just the idea that we can somehow just take what we have right now and somehow magically scale it to what we need in the future. There's a lot that goes into that. So I use the example of potatoes as just to say that don't fall for the people out there that are selling potato batteries. You got to really look into what is this actually something that can scale realistically, right? And it's difficult, I think, and especially in the policy space, because we have a lot of most people in political world are trained in. I'm talking to mostly engineers and scientists here, so y'all can kind of get me on this. But most people in the political world are either they're trained in the humanities, in human behavior and communications, or they're lawyers. They're experts in those areas, and that's really applicable when you're talking about things like education, healthcare, tax and fiscal policy. You write laws to get people to change their behavior to meet a certain outcome. But in energy, we're not only dealing with people, but we're also dealing with physics. And you can't legislate against physics and chemistry. So you have to really keep that in mind in the policy space. That's pretty much why I have a job, is because there's a need for this kind of knowledge in the energy space. And there's a need for us as voters and as average citizens to understand where our energy comes from, so that then we can vote for politicians who understand that and can enact policies appropriately. Because right now we have a lot of magical thinking that goes on in the policy space, and a lot of potatoes that are being sold. So again, recognizing the challenge is essential to solving it, right? We have to be honest about the challenge in order to solve it. And that's kind of what I've tried to present here to y'all, as a kind of an open-ended challenge, right? Here's what we got to do. How are we going to do it? I'm not going to give a whole, like I said, I'm not going to give a whole survey of the entire industry, but I wanted to point out two companies that I think are articulating the challenge correctly and trying to build technologies to meet it, right? So you have Form Energy here on the Riots Group out of MIT, and they're developing what's called a kind of an iron air battery, basically where they take iron and they rust it, right, with oxygen, and then they reverse that process. Reversing that process is pretty difficult, reversing the oxidizing process, but they figured out a way to do it reversibly. And so their materials costs are very low because they're just using iron and air. And they think that they're targeting a cost of below $20 per kilowatt hour capital cost, which is about 10 times lower than what current lithium ion batteries are. So that's, again, they're targeting they're going after the right target. So I have some hope that these guys can really make a difference, because they're starting with the right target in mind. You're talking more than 100 hours. That's basically more than 4 days worth of storage, and a really low price point. That's what we're going for. And also another group that just went public, actually, out of Oregon, called Energy Storage Systems. They have, I believe they just went public. Don't quote me on that, but I have to go back and look it up. But they're also, again, they're very aware that there's limitations to the duration that lithium ion can store energy for. It's difficult to build more and more lithium ion batteries and build them thicker and thicker to make more energy storage. So again, they have kind of an iron flow battery that they're working on that they believe is really scalable, again, for these long duration storage needs. So it's again, I think, just two companies that I kind of keep a close eye on, because again, I think they're going after the right challenge. But they're both just getting started with commercial products, so they have a long ways to go and a lot of scaling up to do. In the end, I think that what we're going to see is we will see a large penetration of wind and solar in energy storage. But once you get to that beyond 50%, you really start to run into that exponential need. You can kind of see it here in the plot on the left side. The cost to get down to really low CO2 emissions with just wind and solar and energy storage rises exponentially up to a certain point, because up to zero, because your storage needs are so great when you have those intermittent sources of energy. But if we maintain a little bit of what this group calls firm low carbon resources, basically carbon capture and nuclear, we maintain some of that generation, we can save a lot on those storage costs. Once you get down into really deep decarbonization, and kind of bring that curve down a little bit. And I think that's probably what we're going to see over time, because it's just, again, physics. we have to understand physics and adjust to that. And I don't think people are going to willing to pay 5-6 times more for electricity just to make this happen. I think we're going to find solutions that are more in the median. So again, with that, I'll just say that kind of key takeaways are that we have a lot of technologies that are being developed, a lot of things that already are being used on the grid. The problem is that their usefulness is limited because of the immense scale required by the electric grid. And also talking about lithium-ion batteries in particular, we've seen their costs go down because of economies of scale, engineering and supply chain improvements, but the fundamental technology improvements are really slow, and they will continue to be. These are really difficult technology, difficult physics and chemistry. And so we have to be cognizant of that and plan accordingly. There's not going to be some kind of I suppose I could be wrong. I can always be wrong, but I don't think there's going to be some kind of magic solution that comes along in the next 10 years. That's going to take a really slow incremental process, and we'll make a lot of improvements, but we have to be aware that process is going to take time. And again, I think in the end, even very cheap wind and solar electricity generation will not necessarily mean that these resources will replace the need for firm generation from probably in the future from natural gas and nuclear. Right? That it's not just a technology problem, but a scaling problem, just like I described on the last plot. And we can, if we maintain some of that firm generation, then we can save a lot on the transmission and the storage costs, and kind of get ourselves into that happier median in terms of cost balance. So with that, I think I've gone just a couple minutes over time, so my apologies for that, but thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for taking, thank you very much for taking time to meet with us today. We really enjoyed and learned a lot from your insightful speech and presentation. Now, as you said, it's time for questions of our audience. So my first question is, could you explain how the electricity production is cheaper than its transportation and storage?
How the generation of it is cheaper?
Electricity production.
Yeah, how the production of electricity is cheaper than
transportation and storage.
Right. Well, with fossil, so I guess I'll put it this way: with fossil fuels, when you bring the fuel out of the ground and bring it's already stored energy, right? Fossil fuels are already stored energy. So all you have to do is bring them out of the ground and take them to your power plant, right? And then you generate the electricity from there. And your storage is done on the front end, right? And you're also able to site power plants close to cities, which is historically what we've done in the United States. You put them close to cities, close to your demand centers, so you don't need as many transmission lines, right? But with wind and solar, your transportation of the energy and your storage of it comes on the back end, right? So when you look at, if you go back to that first, I won't scroll all the way back, but if you look at the first figure that I showed, showing the cost of electricity generation, right? But with fossil fuels like gas, like coal and gas and coal, your energy storage is essentially inherent in that cost calculation, right? Because they're being stored on the storage and transportation occurs mostly on the front end. So when you generate electricity from them, you already have built-in storage and transportation. With wind and solar, you're generating the electricity, but you have to have your storage and transportation on the back end, right? So that's why those numbers are kind of misleading, is because they don't properly account for the storage and transportation costs.
Thank you very much. The next question is, why does the renewable energy percentage prediction go to 100%? Is that percentage even possible between only two energy production methods, those being solar and wind? Following that, why is the nuclear not being considered as a good option for the reduction of fossil fuels being used?
Yeah, I can't agree more. I think, I use those scenarios as kind of hypotheticals, just to see what it would take for us to do that. Since that seems to be, the policy drivers right now are all in favor of wind and solar, right? That's what we're kind of driving towards in terms of all of our policy agenda, both at primarily the federal level. But I agree wholeheartedly that, especially now, again, as I said, in Texas, we're now getting past the point that we're 30% wind and solar. We're getting past the point where we can rely on that without either subsidizing backup generation or building energy storage. But if you add nuclear to that mix, then you can increase your generation of your zero carbon generation and still have a reliable energy, reliable electricity, right? Nuclear is not as flexible as natural gas and coal are, especially natural gas. You can't ramp it up and down easily, so there's a challenge there, meeting demand that way. But absolutely, it's going to be much cheaper in the low carbon future to use a lot of nuclear than it is to try and get to 80 or 100% wind and solar. There's no doubt that it's going to be cheaper.
Thank you very much. The next question is, it's a bit kind of easy, I suppose. Will there ever come a day when we don't use fossil fuels?
Not in my lifetime, because I think it's not just about what we do here in the developed world, right? It's the developing world, and the developing world has, they have to build up their energy systems from scratch. Essentially, I was just doing a case competition for basically where they had students from all over the world submitted ideas for improving into a competition. I was mentoring these students about how to develop more energy in South Sudan. South Sudan is a country that basically has 1% of their country, of their populace, has electricity access, and they basically no modern energy. And so we're building up our capacity to use wind and solar, nuclear, et cetera. All these, if we do carbon capture, all these zero or low carbon electricity sources on the back of our well-developed electric grid. Those countries still have to develop that grid, and so you're not going to see, widespread penetration of electric vehicles for a long time in those markets. You're not going to see, the extensive use of wind and solar like we have in those markets, because they have to start with, what's more simple, and that's fossil fuels. And so I think, in the developed world, we could definitely see, I think we'll see transition away over time. It'll take a long time, but that's only going to benefit us. It's only going to benefit us to a certain, if the cost benefit is right. And that cost benefit in the developing world is heavily towards using more fossil fuels, because for them, that's the most important thing. And that's what they need to build up their energy system before they can start to use more of the low carbon options.
Thank you very much. The last question is, so based on this deduction and expectation, and because of the storage problem, fossil energy can't just be exclusive for just industry and some transport purposes for the meantime.
You say it can't be exclusive.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Trying to
fossil
think.
energy.
Yeah, trying to think of what that question's asking. Try and give a good answer. So I guess what they're saying is that can we just use fossil fuels exclusively for transportation and industry? And I haven't even talked about the other side, which is, I guess, is what this question is asking about, is industrial uses of fossil fuels, right? We use them to make products. We use them to make we use coal to make steel, right? Steel uses about 30% of global coal production is used for making steel. These are all processes that we haven't figured out real substitutes for yet. And that's really going to be a big challenge. There's a lot of talk about using hydrogen in place of natural gas. And maybe there's a future for that. Hydrogen is tough. It's really difficult to store hydrogen. So that's going to be a challenge for sure. But there's talk about that. And then again, yeah, on the transportation side, I can see at least in the developed world, because we have fully developed electric grids, we have the ability to build out the electric charging infrastructure. It's not going to be a cheap or quick process, but I think it's feasible. And I think that with electric vehicles, we're looking at more, and I didn't talk about them much here, but we're looking at more of a 2x cost decrease, right? You still need a big increase in scale, as that one plot that I showed, but you're looking at more of a 2x cost decrease instead of a 10x cost decrease. And that's something that I think will happen more and more over the next 20 years. And given that, plus the fact that we have a well-developed electrical infrastructure, and hopefully if we don't starve ourselves of energy production, because we're going to need a lot more energy production on the grid to power all those electric vehicles. A lot of estimates say that we'll need about 50% more electricity than what we produce now to meet electric vehicle demand. But I can see that happening more and more over time. And also through the use of hybrids, right? You can use hybrids to kind of transition away from using entirely fossil fuels.
So that was my last question. Thank you very much for answering our question with a special attention. It was an honor to meet you today and to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all putting this on, and it's like I said, it's always great to have the opportunity to talk to students. And feel free to reach us at lifepower.org if you want to send me more questions. If you have any thoughts or ideas, I'm always open to hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, dear attendees, you can rewatch this session from your PyPetrus YouTube channel again. Thank you very much and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great day. Good evening.